But yeah, so to kind of continue on, the course, I want the next thing to go over is the MySQL database and the SQL language. I'm going to start with the MySQL database. And basically, the true power of PHP shines when connected to a data source. So so it's an API or a database. That's when you really see the power come to life with PHP. And of course, a database is basically a collection of information. What does that sound like from hearing that? An array, exactly. So you have an array, and it's basically the same thing as it's a collection of data. But why use a database over an array?
Database is way more powerful. You can do a lot more with it than just an array.
Yes. And what pretty much like the things that we've done in those little examples, they've been like maybe a few items, right? But let's say those few items turn into hundreds. Would an array be a good option for that? Right?
The array is stored. It's just not. It's not an efficient way to look at the data and to move it around.
Exactly. Could you search an array?
I don't think so. I'm sure you could.
You'd have to build a function.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. But
right. So those are the things. So you could definitely store data through an array. There's other ways to store data, but a database is definitely, like Jim said, like a very efficient way to store that information, or a large collection of information. And especially if you're starting a new project, like the way we're going to create our own projects, we're starting small. But if your project does take off, which I really would love to see your project grow. That's the thing about scale. Like using a database, you're set up to grow. So that's definitely the best route. Yeah, no, take as many as you want. The difference too with database and array is that data is organized into rows, columns, and tables, and it is indexed to make it easier to find relevant information. So that information is being indexed. Some quick things to know is MySQL is the most popular database when using PHP. It's ideal for both small and large applications. So that's what I mean. Right now we're doing small applications, but it's definitely scalable. It's very fast, reliable, and easy to use. And the best part is that it's free. If you look at other databases, they can also be free, but to host them, that's when your money starts to come up. You have to pay for those services. Now, of course, to host PHP, you need to also pay. But if you compare pricing for hosting a PHP site versus these other databases, you're gonna see, dang, like that's a lot of money just for this small project. You know what I mean? So it's definitely a great feature that it's very low cost. Tables is essentially what make up a database. You can have one, minimum is one, and of course you can have as many. Table divides data into rows with a new entry or record on every row. The data in each row is further broken down into cells or fields. The name fields is something that you should remember, each of which contains a value for a particular attribute of the data. Each table stores information that is similar. So if you have all this data, you want to store the similar information into a table. That way everything's organized in tables. This is a little example of what a table that has basically a list of animals could look like. So the main fields that I have are ID, country, and name. And I'll go over in the details, but it's just kind of give you an idea of what that looks like. And have you guys seen this? Huh? scary, no? It's scary. So my main example here is YouTube, the website, but obviously it's an application that's been built. So you see videos there, but there's a database around all that information. So they probably have a lot more tables in their database, but the main ones are there's a users table because they need people to create accounts and be able to recognize who they are. And then each user is capable of uploading videos, so you have another table called videos, and of course YouTube wouldn't be without any comments or social I don't know, like the social community aspect of it. So there would be another table called comments. Now, if YouTube were to have all this information in one table, it would be very disorganized and very problematic scaling up. So that's why it's important to kind of organize your information into tables and know how to name them. And then just from that one video, you get to see a lot of these comments. So Black Mirror. I don't know if y'all have seen that show, but you haven't seen it? Yeah, it's crazy. You seen it?
Mm-mm.
None of you seen it?
Heard about it, my sister.
Wow. Have you seen it?
A couple episodes.
Okay. Yeah. It's crazy, right?
Very
Yeah. Yeah, they're very disturbing. But things like that robot you saw, I mean, makes like Jurassic Park look like it's not, or the Velociraptors are not as scary compared to that. To me, I think. I don't know. They seem friendlier, the Velociraptors now.
It's kind of funny that they have to make like a handle opening claw though. Someone was like, okay, we need to make a claw that specifically can turn a handle on a door. As opposed to like a general purpose claw.
Yes, exactly. But they'll get it, man. It's scary. Also, you've seen a spreadsheet before, and that's essentially a database. So you have columns, which are basically your fields, and you have rows, which are basically your records or your entries in that table. And at the very bottom, you could kind of consider that a table, which is basically I think they call it like a tab.
What?
I turned on Siri. How did I turn on Siri? Anyway, so a spreadsheet is very database-like, and I think that when you would create a database, you would have to kind of do this previously to kind of map it out. Also want to emphasize like the primary key is super important when you create a table. Each table should have one. Typically, you should call it ID, and it must be unique. That's very important. The ID must be unique. In other words, there's nothing like it. Recommended is to be called that field ID, and even if you have another identifier, like for example, everybody's gonna have a unique email, for example, you still should create an ID field or column. Like that should just be your automatic thing to do. So when you create a table, definitely have an ID in place. And then also you should set it as an integer field type. I'll go over that in a little bit, what the field types are. And also you should set it to auto increment. Auto increment basically says every time a new row is inserted, the next one would have an increment number to it, automatically assigned. So it's not a manual thing done. You don't have to create a function. You don't have to program it. It just does it automatically. Why MySQL doesn't have it automatically, like something like this, I have no idea. Other languages that are more advanced have that implemented already without you having to create this field. So that's a difference why it's really cool to explore those other databases, but for MySQL you still have to create it. Another term that's very important is called normalization. So when you hear the words of normalization or normal form, it's referring to the structure of your database or like the schema or blueprint that you're creating. We create tables to help break up all data. As this builds a structure, it makes it a lot easier to manage and understand what is going on. So it's just a little sketch, but it's really good to have either on paper or using like a data modeling program to kind of list what you're thinking about as how to organize that information and then see it kind of mapped out. So you're creating like a schema essentially of your database. Also, it's really important too, when you have something like this, you can reuse it for a new project. You can take a glance at it, so that way you know where you're kind of repeating yourself, or you're not using enough, or where data's missing, things like that. So kind of see it's kind of like a sitemap when you create a website. I don't know if they kind of implement that in Web 101, but if you guys create sitemaps or anything like that. But that's when you create a website, you should definitely know what you're going to create. Don't just dive into it. That way you kind of build something that's going to be user-friendly. And then the SQL language. So SQL is a language used to communicate with databases. So the database exists, but we need something to communicate with it, and we use SQL. It stands for Structured Query Language, and it's used mostly commonly with relational databases. And MySQL is a relational database. Important SQL commands are like insert, select, update, delete. These are basically commands that you would run to do certain things with the database. So insert is inserting data. Select extracts data. So basically you're trying to query information. Update will update the data, and delete will delete information. Very straightforward, but these are the commands that you would basically execute. The SQL syntax is very similar to like PHP. It's not case sensitive. You need a semicolon at the end. But since it's not case sensitive, for example, that term select is part of the syntax. So if you were to name your table select, what do you think will happen? Yeah. So, or if you name your table delete or insert. So definitely keep in mind keywords that are going to be in your development that you shouldn't use. So those are things to look out for.
I've heard of people doing things where they're like to mess with people's databases. They'll name something like drop table, and it'll screw everything up.
Yeah.
That was an XKCD comic. Did you really name your daughter like drop table something?
Wow. Yeah. So yeah.
I know that stuff's really dangerous.
Oh yeah. Also, if the project you develop, if you have vulnerabilities, where for example that form you guys were creating previously, if someone were to enter, if you created a script that would get that form information and insert it into your database, and there was no security scripts involved in there, people can actually type SQL queries in those text fields. They could be a very small text field, and they can do something like that. They can drop your entire database just like that. Or get all the info. Yeah, it's very scary stuff. So so the naming is very important. Also security. So that's another thing. The insert into syntax. It is possible to write insert into statements in two ways. The first way specifies both column names and the values to be inserted. So in this example, if we had a table called animals, we have 3 fields: ID, country, and name. It's a blank database. There's no information in it. So the first example there, you see kind of like in the middle is we're saying insert into. So that's the syntax I'm writing, and then I'm specifying the database name. In this case, it's animals. And then in parentheses, I'm explicitly saying I'm gonna give you values for these fields. You can comma separate them out. So, but in this case, I'm only doing one. So I'm saying the field is called name. That's the field name. And then I'm also stating here are the values for that. So my value is, and if you can see the single quotes, I'm saying it's a string. So it's essentially a string. The value is eagle. So I'm inserting into the table animals, into specifically the field name, and the value is eagle. So if I run that, you would see a row in the database that says if my ID is automatically set up to be auto increment, and it's a primary key, you would see country being blank because I didn't set a value for it. and it knew to put eagle in the name value or field value because I specified where it was at. The other way of inserting is to not state any how do you call it? Any fields or columns, but you're just saying here are the values for it in the order that they're in the database table. So in that second example at the bottom, you're going to see insert into animals, and the values are America and eagle and string types. And if I run that, I'll get the information I need because it was in the order, the values are in the orders that the table is in. Does that make sense?
Reminds me a little bit of in JSON,
Mm-hmm.
where you can like specify which like thing and then which object inside of it. So you have like people, and then you had Bobby, and then you had like favorite food, pizza or something like that. And you could select specific stuff in that.
Yes. Yeah. And that's also another way to store data. It's a JSON file. So same like an array, you have a JSON file. JSONs are great. So don't ever lose sight of JSONs too. But JSON's not a database, it's just a file. That's another thing. But they are very great. They're very useful.
Could you have a cell that is a combined cell, or would you just have to duplicate the information?
What do you mean by like combine? Like if you have two values in one field?
If you had one value in two fields.
Oh, so you have duplicate content?
Yeah. So would it be possible to combine those cells? Like say you have people's names and what country they're from. And if they're all from the United States, could you just put one big cell that said United States for all those people?
Yes. So like if you I'm trying to figure out what you mean, but there's ways to kind of like query that information. So if you have like this big list, a database table of people, and you want to query specific people that you think are in the United States, is that what you mean? Or if they already have United States as a value, you want to.
I'm just thinking like saving space. Like if I have a table that I'm making a table,
yeah.
I don't want to have to type United States every time.
Oh.
And in my code, that would take up more space if I had United States after every name.
So there's several ways to do that. When you create a table, you can actually set a default value. You can say, so when you create country, you can say default United States. And what that means that if I run this first, if I run that first SQL query there, basically I didn't state country, and I had country set to default United States, it would show United States. So my code doesn't have United States, but the database knows to, if there is no value for it, by default put United States. So that's one way of kind of saving code space. I don't think I answered your question, but right?
Well, it doesn't seem like there would be a way.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you would have to have
I think that causes more problems
each
later.
individual thing. Yeah.
Or you have to have a table that's just like United States. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, it'd have to be a different, because you have to have something set. And typically you wouldn't be writing a database with your bare hands.
Yeah, it makes sense that way. I was just wondering if it was a thing. Because that's what I would do, but I don't design.
Oh, yeah.
I don't design things
Well,
like that for that specific
But
reason.
as you create these things, that's where it's great, where you either create a function that has a default value or something like that, or in the form that people are filling out, you automatically have United States set or something. So you'll definitely figure out a way how to do that. But yeah, that's everybody's way of being creative and why it sets you apart from other people, because you've thought of a way to facilitate those things or reduce code. Or I know that reducing simplifying United States is like a simple example, but it might be like tons of other fields that might be involved in there. But yeah, that's definitely like everyone's way of developing and improving as you go. But yeah, as you see your code, so whatever you create for this course, and then a year from now when you look back at it, you're gonna be like, damn, like that's a lot of code that I wrote. I could totally have this 50-line function be 10 lines, easily. Now that you've kind of grown and figured things out. And I'm sure there'll be functions that will simplify things later. The select syntax is a statement used to select data from the database. The data returned is stored in a result table called the result set. So this one's pretty basic. Basically, you can say select and then state the columns or the fields that you want. And then the other keyword is from, so which table you want it from. So running that would get, all of the data, or all the data that is in that table with those specific fields. Right now, those are the three, so it'll get me all of them. But you can be specific, like I only want the country, so it'll give you the country data set or result set. Another way to run a select is to actually to put an asterisk symbol after the keyword select. And basically what that says, I want everything. I don't want to, so typically your table should be at least, at least 5 to 10 fields. So you don't want to be typing that up every time. Also a good point to going back to this is that if you have a table, first off, I don't recommend that you have a table that's like 100 fields. That's bad programming. But I've had projects that might have 15 or 20. Those 20 might have content description in there. And as we know with WordPress, a content description can be tons of content. They could have copied it from Word and have like all this metadata scrambled in there. You don't see it, or styles or divs or something like that, but each row might have a lot of content to load. So if I were to run this select query there, I would get all the fields. I would get all that body of content for every. Let's just say there was 1,000 rows in that table. That's a lot of information that's getting returned back, and that's going to hurt your processing for your server. That will slow things down tremendously. But if you actually specify which fields you want for that specific view that you're designing, that'll speed up your load time dramatically. So those are the things that you should definitely look out. That as you're building these things, So I went from an asterisk to 3 fields I mentioned, and that made my site load 1,000 times faster. So those are little things that you can do to optimize your site. The update syntax is used to modify existing records in a table. One thing that I want to mention is that the parameter where, basically, it's your condition. If you don't specify correctly, you can really screw things up big time. So if I were to say, same concept of the animals table, if I were to say update animals table, set name equals panda without that last line, which is I'm saying where, if I were just to run those 2 lines, it updates all the rows with the name panda. So now you have this issue where everybody sees panda everywhere, which is not nice. It's not good. So stating the condition, so I'm saying where ID equals 2 means that the row where it says China and the name dragon would update to panda. That's exactly what would happen there. I think I have a little animation there. Very cool animation. Yeah, very wet, very hip. But yeah, so not stating where or not putting the condition correctly can definitely impact big time. Same goes with delete. You can delete things, and you just say delete from, and then the database name, and then state where ID equals 6. If I run that, that's the wrong one. Then there it goes. It would delete that row specifically where I stated. But of course, if I don't say where, it's just going to delete everything. And that's also
very careful.
Yeah. Yes.
And delete is like, once it's done, it's done.
It's done. Yeah. You have to have a backup of it. And what I usually tell everybody is when you're going to start kind of messing around with your database, just back it up. Like the very first thing you do, just back it up, have a file, and then, kind of do what you're supposed to do. If you don't have a backup of it, yeah, you're done.
Back it up somewhere else locally and somewhere remote.
Huh? Oh yeah, yeah.
Learn that the hard way.
Yes, you've already learned that.
Blew up the whole WordPress site by accident. Whoops.
No. Was it hosted somewhere where they would have a backup, or was it local? Where?
It was local,
Oh, yeah.
thankfully, but like,
Yeah.
it was.
Because I was gonna say if it's like a HostGator or something like that, sometimes they charge you, but sometimes they'll have like a week or a month old backup of it, which is nice. But you have like this week of lost data if you're maintaining that big time. So there's good options, but still not. Just because a simple backup didn't take place.
So if you were gonna delete, if you wanted to delete a country for whatever reason, if you just put country in there, would you have to put something before that?
No, so the delete from would be just basically like per row.
So it
Only per row or per entry. That's it. You can though set, so like if you did want to go vertically, you wouldn't do a delete. You would basically do an update. So you can say update animal set country equals, and then you can set null as the value or single quotes. Same thing like with your variables, and then run it. And then instead of saying where, you just leave it alone, and basically it would update all the columns or all the rows with a null value for a country. So that's one way that you could kind of erase that information.
So kind of based on that question, from what I got from my question was, can you delete from animals where country equals China, and it'll delete all the China, right?
Right.
So you can select, you can say where name equals panda, and anything with an animal panda will be gone.
Yes.
Doesn't have to be ID, basically.
It does not have to be
ID.
ID. Yeah. So that's where your condition. So same like when you wrote your PHP conditions, you're saying like if this variable equals this, and the answer was true, then it would execute that block of code. Same here, delete from or update from, that would take place. And if you're not comparing, so right now I'm saying like ID equals 6, you're seeing that 6 is not a string, it's an integer. So if you were comparing, if you're doing a condition that with a different field that might not be an integer, you would need to wrap that in quotes, because then it won't be true. What I typically do when running these things, delete is super dangerous for me. I don't like delete at all. It's super scary till today, and I've done it, thousands of times. But I actually run a select. Go back. I actually run something like this because I can say select, and then I can do the asterisk symbol from animals where, and then put my condition there. And instead of deleting or updating, I can actually see what is returned from that condition. So I'll know that when I replace select to delete or update, I know what I'm gonna do. So I'm actually seeing a preview of what I'm about to do. Also, another cool thing too is I'm trying to remember if it's a line of code that you add, but you can roll back as well. So so basically you're previewing, so you can actually put like your delete or update syntax, and then preview it, so it'll actually run it, but it'll roll back automatically. So anything deleted or updated, it'll kind of so it'll tell you like, hey, everything went good. There's no errors in your syntax, but everything's back to normal. So that's some way of preview. I don't have an example of that, but that's also possible to do. But for me, like my way of doing it, I just run a select, and I can preview what I'm about to do. It's take forever now. Go. Okay. So any questions on the SQL? I mean, there's tons of stuff, but okay. So I'm gonna just jump into PHP MyAdmin. How many people have used it? I think you use it a little bit. Have you used PHP MyAdmin? A little bit.
Good time to use it.
Okay. So PHP MyAdmin is basically the most popular application to manage your MySQL databases. So that SQL language that you saw earlier is basically something you can run without this application. You don't need PHP MyAdmin. PHP MyAdmin is just basically a user-friendly way to manage your database. So you can basically do the same things that you can do with SQL, except it's got like a GUI, or it's like a visual application that allows you to do all that. So it's very intuitive, I think, compared to, it's not, you might see that you're like, oh, it looks ugly. But if you look at other databases, like what other people have created to manage their database, it's like they just do it on command line. Like that's all they do. So this compared to like what people have tried to do, this is way nicer. So compared to those, that's why I say it's intuitive. Yeah.
So for PHP MyAdmin, basically what I've only used it for is when we're creating WordPress stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and we want to, we're testing it locally. It's like we use PHP MyAdmin to like create a database,
Mm-hmm.
then WordPress
Takes over.
stuff. Yeah.
Exactly.
That
Yeah.
was basically what I did.
Yeah.
My hosting service, the default was PHP MyAdmin, so I created a database.
And then you left. Yeah.
Installed WordPress.
Not in this case. you're gonna use it a little bit more now.
Well, if you're ever backing up a WordPress database, you'll probably use it then also.
I used
To
one
get the
called
backup.
WordPress,
Or
WordPress duplicator or something like that, and it literally made a copy of everything, including your database.
Oh, okay. So it just took over. So I guess it just did not only the database but the files too.
Yeah, files.
so like another reason you might need to go in there is if you have like a staging site
Mm-hmm.
and then you move your files on your database to the live site and then you actually have to go in there and do like, update the URL
Yes.
manually.
Oh yeah.
So
right.
I mean,
Yeah. There's definitely
There'll
use
be
for it within
times.
WordPress. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you get that? What you said about changing URLs on WordPress?
Like if you have,
like a staging site, like if you're gonna change the domain name,
Right.
basically.
oh, okay.
Yes.
I was thinking of like if you change the URL, like you make a post and like it has
Oh.
the little,
Oh, the permalink.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and then you like maybe you rename it and then
Right.
it changes it.
But yeah,
No,
this
you're talking about something different, right?
the
Talking about,
the
like,
domain in
The
general.
actual domain.
Yeah.
Yeah, like abc.com, you're gonna change it to 123.com,
Mm-hmm.
and you copy the database and you put it on your new,
Right.
like, whatever, new database, and then you go in there and search, right, like.
Yeah. So like exactly what Judy's saying. So like let's say you build like this news website, and let's say they have thousands of posts on the site, and each post there's like text links inside that link to other posts. You can't do that from a settings, aspect, and you can't go in each one and change the URL. You know what I mean? So that's what Judy's saying. In those cases, you would have to go to PHP MyAdmin and do a search and replace.
Mhm.
A search and replace script
Okay.
to make those
Oh.
changes. Because not only does it change the site, because the site settings for WordPress, there's only like one or two fields in the config,
It's
Table?
not a lot.
but everything else exists. Like when you upload a photo, it automatically assigns a URL. Even if you change the settings URL, it won't update the URLs of every image or file you uploaded. That stays static there. So the only way to do that is to manually change it. But there's scripts to run in.
Yes.
Those are the SQL queries that you would run to do a search and replace. Yeah. So there's definitely a lot of even in WordPress, even though you create a database, you're definitely gonna have a need for it. And then just like that, so you can actually run SQL through it. So there's an actual SQL tab. You can. It actually has. I don't have it there, but there's like little buttons that kind of help you generate your SQL script there, so you can actually run it. But you can type it, and it has a color coding, so you see like select and column name and things like that. And it'll actually also display. If you're in the table view, it'll actually help you display what field names you have, so you can refer to them pretty easily. And then what we were talking about earlier, you can import and export we do this, like I said, the minute you're in here, this should be your first step. You should go in here and you should, well, not this view, but you should export your data into basically it's like a gzip file it creates, and it has all your tables, all your data into one file. Definitely do that. And then of course when things go wrong or you're going production in a different web server, you would go to this view where you would import your exported file into here, or your backup file.
I have a question.
Mhm.
It's probably something that someone has made, but is there like natively some kind of like automatic backup thing
Yeah.
for PHP MyAdmin?
Yeah, so both PHP and MySQL are command line accessible. So if you can do it several ways. So you can either do it manually. So if you log into your server through SSH, basically command line. Once you have access to your server, you can then enter to the MySQL command line, having the username and password. Not anybody. So one way, if someone hacks your server, they get in. That doesn't necessarily mean they can access your information. They still need to know the username and password, but they'll figure it out. They're smart by the time. But once you get access to MySQL, then you can run those commands to dump. I think it's like a MySQL dump command, and then you specify the file name. So you're going to say like 2000. You maybe put a dynamic like year and date on it. That way your backup file has a unique name to it. And then save it in this directory, maybe it's like a backups directory or something like that. But that's manually done. Have you heard of cron jobs? So cron jobs are they basically function in Apache server, which is basically everything you guys are doing, WordPress, what we're doing. You're going to run Apache. There's a function called cron job, which basically you can run a command line in a specified time. But recurring. So if you want to say like every day at 5 a.m. I want to create a dump of this database I have into this directory and in this file name, it'll do that every single day. Or if you want to do it every 3 hours or once a week or every Sunday or something at midnight, you can do it. So there's ways to automate. So you can do it manually, or you can set a cron job to do it for you. WordPress also has ways to interact with cron jobs. So for example, if you create a WordPress site and you have people submitting applications for, let's just say a job or something like that, and you wanted to, instead of every time sending an email to you, for every single entry, let's say you get thousands of entries a day, instead of getting 1,000 emails, maybe you just want a list of names in one email. So you can create a cron job that every day or at midnight or something of every day it queries all these rows in the database or the form submissions, and then gets just the name of the people or whatever you want to display in the email, and then creates an email and then sends it to you or to whoever manages the applications. So you can actually integrate really cool cron jobs with WordPress, which is really nice. Well, I don't know if Ninad will go over WP CLI, but it's basically running WordPress with a command line. It's also really, really cool. But yeah. And then creating a database is exactly what you guys have already done, and then just taking off, which is you just go create table. Create a database, and then once you create a database, then well, I guess not even on WordPress you would need to create a table. You would just create a database, and then you're done. But the creating a table is just as easy as creating a database. And you just need to know how many fields that are ballpark. You can always add to it. So there's this number here is not the end of the world. You can always lower it or grow. The column types. So remember what I mentioned, the ID field. I wanted to make it an integer type. There's a lot. So if you Google like the MySQL columns or field types, you're going to see this huge list of how many types are. There's a lot. Or if you go to MySQL or PHP MyAdmin and you're going to create a table and edit a field or create one, you can actually see a big list of a drop-down that is. And you have to choose one from that list. So it's your job as a developer to know, and also kind of sucks, to know what kind of field you're creating here. So if I create, for example, address, like I want to get the street address of, so I call my field name address, and I set it to variable or bar chart, basically is like a variable string, and that size there is basically saying how many characters can this field contain, or the value, what's the max character size for that value. So let's say I create an address and I state I want a varchar type, and I put, let's just say 80, I don't know, like 80. That means that whoever's submitting a form and they're putting their address and their address extends 80, it'll cut off at 80. You won't see the rest of whatever they were entering. It just gets cut off. So if you don't know about that problem, and you know, in a month after submissions have already passed, you've already lost a month of information that people have submitted. You can't go back. Of course they can edit, but that's time consuming. You've already kind of lost that information there. So knowing what type and what property size you set is very important. So the main ones are the integer, the variable, the text, which is basically a string, but it's capable of storing a larger amount of information in a text format, and a very popular one that we use is datetime. So whenever someone inserts a new row, you want to know when that happened. So datetime is a really good one. You can always date, but date will only store the date. It won't store the time. Time is crucial because you know exactly what minute, what second that happened. So to me, there's the most important ones, but there's tons more. There's like Boolean. There's also text long. So if text is not big enough, you can state, that's another thing. So if you say text and then you find out that the way people are using your application, actually they put more information that you thought of, you can, but hopefully you catch it in time where you're like, oh, okay, let me change it to text long. So now people can actually continue adding more information. But those are the ways to know how to change those. But like I said, you have to do your research and figure out which ones you're going to use. It's very important. And I mentioned the primary key and just this little screenshot of what it would look like on PHP MyAdmin. So you don't see the row, so I would say the field name's ID to the left, but here I would say primary there. I would state primary. You could see the other fields would not need it because I would only want one to be a primary. And then that A_I means auto increment, so I want to set auto increment for that ID as well. That's crucial. Okay.